Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of focus on something called Zone 2 in endurance training. It's in loads of different podcasts talking about longevity. It's recommended by fitness influencers to maximize fat loss. It's in runners slowing down on the basis of what their smartwatch is telling them. It's a weird kind of prestige of not looking like you are trying very hard. Now, the idea of Zone 2 has actually been around for years as a relatively technical training concept, but it's now something closer to a public health aesthetic. And in that popular discourse, Zone 2 is often presented as if it was a single, clearly bounded physiological reality. A little bit of a metabolic sweet spot where fat burning, mitochondrial development, aerobic base building, and longevity all line up in one neat package. But the reality is that Zone 2 is not a single standardized physiological construct. It's more complicated than it initially seems. That basic definitional instability is probably the root cause of all the confusion. So what exactly are we talking about when we say Zone 2? Okay, so from the outset, I'll say that Zone 2 is not a single standardized physiological construct. It's a coaching label that has been mapped onto lots of different zone systems and threshold concepts that only partly overlap. And this is the first trap, because people argue about Zone 2 as if they are debating one thing, but often they're not. They're using the same words for different physiological models. So what are those models? Well, there are two that we need to be aware of. The first uses maximal anchors, things like percentage of maximum heart rate, percentage of VO2 max, peak speed or peak power. The second uses threshold or domain anchors, things like the first or second lactate threshold, the first ventilatory threshold, critical power, or related markers intended to separate different physiological domains. Now, those distinctions matter because not all anchors behave equally well. One of the major criticisms in the exercise prescription literature is that fixed percentages, things like 70% of max heart rate or 80% of VO2 max or 2 millimoles of lactate, they don't reliably place different individuals into the same physiological domain. Two people can be at the same percentage of their VO2 max on paper and still be in meaningfully different metabolic states. Threshold-based anchors then tend to have better validity for separating exercise domains, even if they too are measured with imperfect methods. So those are the anchors, but they are also used inside different zoning models. One of the most common is a simple 3-zone model, where the zones are usually organized around 2 thresholds. Zone 1 is below the first threshold, Zone 2 between the first and second thresholds, and Zone 3 is above the second threshold. In this system, Zone 2 is not especially easy. It's the middle region, the space between thresholds. And in classic training intensity distribution research, that is often the zone athletes do relatively little of, compared with all the work below the first threshold and the smaller but meaningful amount above the second. Another really common model is the 5-zone coaching system. In this kind of model, Zone 2 often refers to a low-intensity aerobic endurance zone below the first lactate or ventilatory threshold. Tempo and threshold work get pushed up into zones 3 and 4, so now suddenly Zone 2 is not the middle lane at all, it's part of the easy lane. And this is where the confusion begins, because two people can both be talking about Zone 2 and still be referring to different physiological territory entirely. And once the term becomes untethered from a specific model or threshold, the claims built on top of it start to blur as well. Zone 2 can begin to mean low-intensity endurance training in general, or training near the first threshold, or simply just cardio with metabolic benefits. And those are clearly not the same. So when people talk about the benefits of Zone 2, the first question is actually, which Zone 2 do you mean? Do you mean the middle domain in a threshold-based 3-zone model, or the low-intensity endurance range in a 5-zone model? Are you anchoring to lactate, or ventilation, or heart rate, or power, or pace? Are you using a wearable estimate, or a talk test? Until those questions are cleared up, the claim is much less precise than it sounds. And that disparity is reflected in the research. A recent study that compared the markers used to demarcate Zone 2 training showed that common field markers do not line up neatly across people. The first ventilatory threshold, and what is called fat max, the exercise intensity at which the body burns the highest absolute amount of fat, aligned reasonably well in some cases, but fixed percentages of maximum heart rate and fixed lactate thresholds varied widely in how accurately they reflected the intended metabolic state. That basically punctures the fantasy that there is one universally reliable shortcut. No single number slips into the body like a master key. And the problem is not just theoretical either. In another study of recreational runners, fixed anchors used to estimate the first and second lactate thresholds, LT1 and LT2, produced non-trivial error and misclassification risk. At something like a fixed 80% of maximum heart rate, many runners may actually be sitting in different physiological domains. So prescribing exercise intensity based on heart rate zones gives a kind of comfort of specificity, but it doesn't always deliver the physiology we think we're prescribing. Now, this doesn't mean that training zones as a concept is useless. That's not what I'm getting at. Zones are useful because physiology is continuous and training requires decisions. Categories can be helpful because we need ways to translate lab concepts into actual sessions. We need the language that coaches and athletes and ordinary exercisers can use in the real world. But the scientifically correct way to think about it is that zones are just models of the underlying physiology, and thresholds are waypoints within those models. So the foundation of us being able to evaluate whether zone 2 is special or beneficial in some way is to first explicitly define it. And the framing I'll use here is from a paper published last year, which defined zone 2 as work near but below the first lactate or ventilatory threshold. And now that we have a definition of zone 2 that we can stand behind, we can actually figure out what training at this intensity is beneficial for in terms of performance or health-based outcomes, and whether it is superior or inferior to other training zones. In other words, what is this intensity supposed to be doing inside the body? Well, in simple terms, if you spend enough time training at this intensity, you improve your aerobic machinery. You stimulate mitochondrial adaptations. You improve your ability to oxidize fat. You build an aerobic base. You become, in some broad physiological sense, more efficient. The main advantage of zone 2 type work is that it is sustainable. You can usually do quite a lot of it without digging a huge recovery hole. It lets athletes accumulate meaningful aerobic training volume with relatively low acute stress, which is one reason it fits so naturally into high volume endurance programs. That workable intensity idea fits closely with the general conclusion that easy volume is pragmatically defensible, even where stronger uniqueness claims are not. And I think that's really important. A lot of the appeal of zone 2 is not necessarily that it is some magical physiological sweet spot. It's that it is a workable intensity. It's hard enough to create an aerobic stimulus, but easy enough to repeat, easy enough to recover from, easy enough to stack on a daily or weekly basis. And that's important because endurance training is about what you can sustain over long periods. So from that point of view, zone 2 makes a lot of sense. And mechanistically, the argument for zone 2 usually centers on aerobic metabolism. At these lower subthreshold intensities, the body is relying heavily on oxidative metabolism to meet energy demands. Lactate accumulation is relatively controlled. Ventilation is manageable. The exercise can continue for a long time. And because the effort is sustainable, the cumulative metabolic signal over a long session can be substantial. That's where all the mitochondria talk comes from. Mitochondria are obviously central to aerobic energy production. The idea is that repeated endurance work at this sort of intensity helps stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis and broader oxidative adaptations. And there is evidence that prolonged endurance exercise can activate the canonical signaling pathways associated with those adaptations, things like AMPK, P38, and PGC1 alpha. There's also the fat oxidation story, because as exercise intensity rises from very low levels into moderate domains, fat oxidation tends to increase up to an individually variable point called fat max, before dropping off again at higher intensities. So zone 2 gets rhetorically tied to this idea that it sits in the right neighborhood for teaching the body to use fat well. And then all of that, mitochondria, fat oxidation, aerobic metabolism, durability, gets wrapped together into one very appealing narrative. Train here and you become more aerobically developed in a deep foundational way. And there's a lot of sense to that story. At its core, the defensible claim is that zone 2 type work is a very good way to accumulate aerobic training volume, and that it supports a range of aerobic adaptations over time. If you're an endurance athlete trying to train often, this kind of intensity is practical precisely because it gives you the stimulus without the same recovery cost as harder work. But, and this is where we have to be careful, there is a very big difference between saying zone 2 is a useful, sustainable way to accumulate aerobic work and saying zone 2 is uniquely special. And that is one of the main problems with the popular discourse around zone 2. You'll often hear that zone 2 is where the real mitochondrial magic happens, or that it is the best way to build fat oxidation, or that it is the true home of aerobic development. That if you go any harder, you somehow leave the realm of smart endurance training and enter the land of noise, strain and diminishing returns. But the evidence does not really justify the stronger claim that zone 2 is uniquely best for those outcomes. A recurring theme in the research is exactly this problem of non-uniqueness. Take mitochondrial signaling. One study showed that a prolonged endurance session, around 90 minutes at roughly 65% of VO2 peak, increased nuclear PGC1 alpha abundance and activated signaling pathways associated with mitochondrial biogenesis. Fair enough. But another line of evidence shows that low-volume, high-intensity interval training can also increase nuclear PGC1 alpha abundance and mitochondrial gene expression. So already the claim starts to shift. The question is not, can zone 2 stimulate mitochondrial adaptation? It can. The question is zone 2 the only way to do that? And the answer appears to be clearly not. And that pattern shows up again when you move from acute mechanisms to training studies. For example, a classic controlled comparison study found that just 2 weeks of low-volume sprint interval training produced similar early increases in oxidative markers, things like COX activity and protein content, compared with much higher volume endurance training, while also improving time trial performance in a comparable way. That's a pretty awkward finding if your whole theory is that these oxidative adaptations belong uniquely to long, steady, low-intensity work. The body, it seems, is quite willing to adapt through more than one route. And the same issue crops up with fat oxidation. Yes, it is true that during exercise, fat oxidation tends to peak at moderate, individually variable intensity, the thing referred to as fat max. And yes, that means zone 2 often gets associated with burning more fat, but this is where people often slide very, very quickly from an acute fuel use observation to a much bigger training claim. Burning more fat during a session is not automatically the same thing as becoming better at endurance performance. And it is not automatically the same thing as proving that zone 2 is the uniquely best training intensity for improving fat oxidation capacity over time. In fact, the evidence suggests that just 2 weeks of high-intensity aerobic interval training, participants showed about 36% increase in whole-body fat oxidation when they were later tested during moderate intensity exercise. So even this supposedly zone 2 adaptation does not seem to belong exclusively to zone 2. And that really is the central complication for the popular zone 2 story, because the popular story often sounds like a narrow sweet spot theory, as though there is one privileged metabolic lane where the important aerobic adaptations happen best. But the evidence points toward a more pluralistic picture. Different intensities can produce overlapping adaptations. They may do so through different constraints, different recovery costs, and different time efficiency profiles. But the outcomes, whether we're talking about cellular adaptations or performance, are not as exclusive as the rhetoric suggests. So the conclusion? Zone 2 is useful, but it is not uniquely special. It is a practical way to accumulate aerobic work with manageable recovery cost. The evidence just does not justify the stronger claim that it is the one privileged zone for mitochondrial adaptation, fat oxidation, or aerobic development. The best way to frame it then is not, is zone 2 best? It's best for whom, for what, and compared with what. It's a less glamorous question, but it's better scientifically.